Hey, Gavin, I made you an espresso.
Oh, thanks. I don't drink coffee.
Oh.
But, can you show me your studio?
Yeah, let's go.
What a journey, man. You've gone through a lot to make this room what it is. You should be very proud of it. I just listened to it right before we started filming, and man, sounds amazing.
It was so worth it.
Yeah.
It was such a struggle, but the payoff was so huge.
Yeah. You probably had wanted to convert to Atmos for a while, but what was the main thing that said, I gotta do this?
It was two things really. It was one, once I started thinking that I was gonna go Atmos, I really knew that the install of a system like this was so in depth that once it was in, there will likely never be changes made to the room again. But really the initial thing was when me and Josh were working on putting the subwoofer in, and we tried to tune the room, and it just wasn't working. Mm-hmm. And I felt like I had my heart broke a little bit, because the room that I had done such cool work in, that I was so happy with the work that I had done in, it went from that to like feeling like it was so subpar. And I'm a kind of a perfectionist in a lot of ways. And so once I knew with my own ears and with the data on the screen how big of a problem this room has, that was like constantly just in the back of my head, like, sure, this has to get fixed one day. And then once it was time to pull the trigger and go for Atmos, that was like the perfect time.
Yeah.
Not the perfect time in the sense that, you know, it's trying to stack that much on my plate all at once, but like if it was gonna happen, it needed to happen then.
Yeah. Well, and I commend you too with making that switch to Atmos. A lot of times people are just like, well, I'm just gonna throw up the speakers and then I'm good. But you actually, when we started talking, you're like, there's some things about the room acoustically that I think if we're doing this all at once, let's just take care of it.
That, one, because I'm a perfectionist, two, because I want all of the blame for shortcomings to be on my skill set.
Sure. Not
on the room, not on the gear. If there's a subpar thing happening, I want it to be my fault, because that means it's something I can fix with my own skill set. It's a problem I can somewhat easily solve. That, and I had heard some other Atmos rooms that just were not so inspiring, but I also heard some other Atmos rooms that were like kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah.
And if I'm gonna go through the time and effort and money to do this, I want it to be on the mind-blowing side.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the acoustical elements that are in the room. You had already treated this space pretty well. Like you had already done some stretched fabric systems and 2-inch treatment in a lot of places.
Yeah.
But what was lacking was just a little bit of bass trapping, and this was a great opportunity to upgrade that in this process.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, when we first started talking, we discussed whether or not we would be able to hit the target without replacing all the 2-inch treatment on the walls with 4-inch or 6-inch or whatever. And because trying to be budget conscious and time conscious now that I know how long this took, I'm really pumped that we were able to hit that target.
Yeah.
While not tearing everything out and starting over.
For sure. And we had initial data that Josh had done in the room, and we kind of knew where the struggle points were, and we were able to design around that. So I think that leaving that in place was a huge time saver, like you said, but then allows us to just focus on the low end side of things. All right, we're here with Josh S.O.U.N.D from Focal. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And also, thanks for getting us involved in this cool project.
Yeah, anytime.
What was the biggest challenge that you had with this space?
Honestly, the space wasn't the challenge, really. I think it was probably more kind of figuring out timelines. It takes a lot of time, and sometimes you hit roadblocks, and you have to kind of be able to adjust on the fly and figure out how you're going to manage that. Overall, like, it was pretty, I think planning probably helped a lot, and definitely like all the drawings and documentation you guys provide, and just the conversations we had ahead of time kind of made the overall process a lot easier.
Yeah, and it wasn't without a lot of hard work. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of people that would, hire this out and say, like, I'd like you to take care of this, and then you're enjoying it in a month or two versus a longer period of time. But it's probably something pretty rewarding about doing it yourself too.
It was the end result is very rewarding. Yeah. And also just, if I'm being honest, the financial side of it, like, I don't know that I could have afforded to hire every part of this out. Right. It's, I think I do believe in this format as the future, and I want to be involved in it as early as I possibly could be. But it would have taken a lot longer to get there if I had to save up the resources to hire all of it out.
Yeah. You built this room before we were ever involved.
Yes.
And did some treatment on your own that was working great.
Yep.
It's just a matter of, it's like getting to that last 20%. It's like that you can get
Yes.
80% of the way there pretty easily.
Yep.
And then it was that last little bit to dial it in.
And that last little bit is so hard to get to. And just for me, I don't have the knowledge of how to get there on my own. Like I needed help.
Yeah.
You know, and you and Josh being involved in this, and like watching just the emails that you guys sent back and forth in the planning stage.
What are these nerds talking
Was
about?
so crazy, like working out speaker angles and dimensions. I was like, this would be impossible for me to do and get to this result, I should say, on my own.
Sure.
I could have thrown some speakers up, but I couldn't have done this.
Some of the things that we added to the room, a lot of it was vertical corner base trapping, where trying to get as much in the corners as possible to help with tangential modes in the room. Not only vertical corners, but horizontal corners like we did in the front of the room. Have a between the wall and ceiling juncture, same thing on the back wall, these large base traps, which posed some challenges because you had HVAC up there and we had to kind of route that through there. But and then even the back wall has some pretty thick treatment that diffuser is built into. You can kind of see it at the door when you walk in, how thick that back wall is. And those are just elements that were missing a little bit. We also added some treatment above the ceiling clouds and added new ceiling clouds in here, which were all kind of part of the plan. The
biggest challenge of the whole room was honestly how to wrap that fabric around the diffuser. Because, and I don't even know that you necessarily specified in the plans whether it would be outside the fabric, inside the fabric, or half recessed. But I think in the render that you gave me, it was half recessed. And once I saw that, I'm like, that's how it has to be. There was a lot of little challenges with like adapting wiring, like the lights in the soffits were not there obviously, and HVAC, figuring out how to extend HVAC without tearing into existing stuff and modifying too heavily. And there was just a lot of that. Another challenge was all of the fabric track on the back wall and the soffits are all is it the 1 inch or the half-inch track? The half-inch, right?
I think so.
That was actually significantly harder to work with than the 2-inch track. The 2-inch track is a cakewalk once you know what you're doing. Those were the big challenges. And then I commissioned these ceiling clouds to be made, and when they got them here, they almost didn't fit through the door. It was like, it was almost a really bad scenario. We had to turn them around a bunch of times and finally fit, you know. So the big ceiling cloud here is roughly 11 foot by 8 foot. It's a pretty large ceiling cloud, and we made it more than twice as thick per your specification. So it used to only have a single layer of 2-inch treatment in it, and I was able to modify it and you know, make it so that way it would hold almost 6 inches. So there's 3 layers up there now, which was a huge deal. And then adding these clouds, which are also 6 inches, made a huge difference.
And you probably get pretty proficient with the stretch fabric system now.
I am, yes.
And so you obviously did that before. It's Fabric Wall is who you used for that?
I used Fabric Wall, and the fabric is from Guilford of Maine. It's their Anchorage collection.
And we even, in the process, we sent you a bunch of renderings.
Which was hugely helpful. Because I like this color. I'm happy with this color. But after living with it, and I do so much filming in here, that it is a very skin-toned kind of color. So I was just, if the color was ever gonna change in the room, this was obviously the time to do it. But I'm so bad at the coloring side and the interior design side of things. So I asked you, I'm like, can you send me some renders of different colors? I think you sent me 12 different colors or something. And it was so helpful. I was very close. After seeing your Tim Henson rune, I was very close to going white with black, because man, his rune is just unreal looking.
Appreciate that.
But I was nervous that it might be a little too contrasty on film and in photos. The vibe of that room is awesome, but I was nervous it wouldn't come across on camera as well as this room. So I ultimately elected to stay. I wanted this room to be more visually dynamic, and I was like, how do I make this room more visually dynamic with kind of, if I'm being honest, the least amount of effort, because it all took so much effort anyway. And just putting a simple thing like putting lights in the soffit, putting an extra light switch over there so the soffits are on their own thing, and then it just makes for such cool lighting, especially as it gets dark here, which it will be very soon. The nighttime vibes in here are just so cool with everything dimmed and warm, and it's awesome. It was well worth it. And going to the Philips RGB system was awesome. Like right now we're filming in daylight white balance light, which I wouldn't never work in. And then on the app, I just switch it, and in 10 seconds, it's a totally different vibe in here.
Most of the renovations that we did to the acoustical treatment in here was focused around the low end. It's like, because you had done a really good job with adding 2-inch fiberglass panels, fabric wrapped in here in the correct areas. Just some of the base traps in the corners, we wanted to improve upon that. The back wall trap, adding some diffusion on the back wall was a nice addition too. But even soffit traps around the room. There's just a bunch of elements that just are focused in on that low end. And that reverb time you mentioned, it's like you want that to be consistent in all frequencies, not just the mids or the highs. It's like that low needs to match, or else it's going to mask everything that's going on above that.
Yeah, and that was a significant difference. It was awesome. The other thing, the finish on that Acoustic diffuser, when it showed up, I obviously saw pictures of it, but you can't really tell how beautiful it is until you open the box. And then I'm posting, Insta stories of it, and people are like, "Oh, nice plastic diffuser," and I'm like, "It's not.
It's not. Right.
That's real hardwood. It looks so perfect.
Yep.
I can't believe how good it looks."
The back wall was one of the biggest challenges that you had in this process. Not only was this furred out another foot or so from what it was, but then you also had the soffit trap with the HVAC having to be extended, added some lights in there, which I think is great for shadows on this Acoustic diffuser.
Exactly.
Once you see it, you're like, man, okay, that probably wasn't that difficult, but
it's a wall.
It's a wall, right? It's just, but yeah, I mean, there's so much framing and getting things right and interacting with the channel system.
Yes, and because I have angled walls, the upper walls are angled here. There was just so many different compound angles. And I think, until you get in and do a project like this, you don't realize that on a corner, when they mud drywall, it's not a perfect 90-degree corner anymore. It gets built in. So that kind of messes with your dimensions of your lumber. And so since mudding drywall is a variable, it's never exactly the same thing. There's no two boards in that soffit that are exactly the same length.
That's fun.
All of them are different, and between that and just trying to wrap my head around how to run a single seam of fabric, because ultimately that's what you have to do. Every seam, there has to be a continuous line throughout every piece of fabric. And trying to make sure that lines up without any wrinkles, without any problems. There's a couple wrinkles here and there that I wish could have been better, but man, for doing it myself and for how much time it took and for how difficult it was to get it all to line up, I'm really happy with how it turned out.
It is not an easy process, which again, I will shout out the video you created on this. It's so cool to be able to see some of it's just time lapse of what you were doing. But I remember, I think even on this back soffit, you had a camera set up in the framing and showing how you're stuffing insulation and getting everything
Getting the wiring set up for the light.
Yeah. I think it's just so valuable what you do for other people that are wanting to do the same thing, to be able to have something as kind of a keystone to look at and say like, hey, I can do this because I saw Colt do it.
Totally, thank you, I appreciate that. Yeah, in the early days, the first edition of this room, when I originally did the stretched fabric system, there was just no info out there. You couldn't find anything out about it, and half the companies didn't even want to sell it to you because you weren't a contractor, and like you didn't know how to do it. There were no tutorials. It was just, and luckily I had one person kind of say, hey, you should buy this and do this, and then made the video on it, because that's a big part of what I try to do on the channel, is try to be the mentor to people that I wish that I would have had. And that kind of comes through all of this stuff. Like if there's no info out there on how to do a stretched fabric system, I want to do that.
Yeah, and I think that's why the channel has success. People are looking for that sort of thing, and I mean, I know that we're working on a lot of projects right now where I just send links to your video of this space, because we can talk through things until we're blue in the face about like how this gets done, but just to watch someone else do it, it just means a lot to people. So I know that one of the challenges of having an Atmos room is suddenly there's a lot more cabling that goes into it.
There's over 540 foot of XLR cable in this rig, just for the speakers.
Yeah.
Not for rack gear, just for speakers.
Especially in a retrofit situation.
Yes.
Obviously, if we're designing a studio from the ground up, we're always putting conduit underneath the concrete or running it in a floated floor. You didn't have that luxury here.
I didn't have that luxury, and it's something that may get changed. Currently, I've kind of bundled it together into this snake that runs from front to back.
Yeah.
When we built this house, we built it around the studio originally, and so the floors are all doubled and tripled up floor joists under here and big beams and everything, and there's a 5-layer sandwich floor here that we're standing on. And so when it came time to figure out the cabling, it was just, do I want to compromise my soundproofing and cut holes through all of that?
Sure.
And because the floor joists run this way, I would have to build a trough in the ceiling of the garage down below.
Yep.
It's something that I may do in the future, but once it really came down to it, I'm like, I don't know that I want to go through all that.
Right.
So I elected to just live with this snake thing for a while. We'll see how much it impedes my workflow.
Sure.
How much it, it makes clients uncomfortable, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
We may end up building a trough down below, but for now, it doesn't look bad, and it's not too bad.
Honestly, after watching the video of you putting this whole place together, I think you're allowed to pass on something like this. I don't know. I mean,
Well, thank you.
So we talked about some challenges. What are some things that were like a pleasant surprise that you didn't expect with this project?
The pleasant surprise, was certainly the end result. I mean, the fact that it was so much better than I honestly could have imagined. The most mind-blowing thing to me, which I still am not sure I fully understand, is how using 2 subwoofers crossed over at the right frequency solved that problem. Like, you look at the before and after charts, and it was like the Grand Canyon to like a cornfield in Iowa.
Yeah.
Like, it was just so crazy how once those were set in the right spot and crossed over at the right frequency, that it literally just fixed the problem.
One phenomenon we see like very, very often is just the modal distribution of the room can create some issues with one sub. And in this case, we had like a really significant amount of inconsistency in the bottom end. I think the dip on the bottom that we were experiencing, I think it was roughly around 100 hertz, if I'm correct, was like in the neighborhood of 12 or 13 dB. It was a lot.
Sure.
And I said, well, this is obviously a modal thing because, we were changing the phase relationship of the sub and we still had this issue. And we started moving stuff around, but we just really couldn't nail it down. So I said, hey, Gavin, like, I've got a problem. And he says, well, try putting 2 subs in here, here, or here. And we did that. So we essentially took these 2 subwoofers and put them at the third points of the room, and that just broke up that distribution. And all of a sudden, we crossed everything over. We saw what the room was doing, made sure the speakers were catered and the crossover was catered to that. And all of a sudden, now, like in that 100 hertz range, it's like 2 dB of variation.
Yeah. A lot of people, when they adding the subs, I mean, obviously you're getting additional SPL at the lower frequencies, but a lot of times people don't know that you can use subs to handle room mode issues. It's more so just kind of placing them in the room and thinking, oh, well, that's going to give me more bottom end, but it depends on where they're placed, how many you have, how you tune them, all of that.
Yeah, it's, I would say of all the things that we run into with customers on a regular basis, I would say subwoofers are probably the ones that can cause the most damage, but can also create the most benefit. Like a sub in the wrong place can wreck things.
Oh yeah, or putting a sub that's putting too much energy in a really small room. I mean, we have a lot of space here, which is helpful, but sometimes people are putting the subs in 10 by 10 bedrooms and it's making more trouble than it's worth.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, like if it's a production room and it's just supposed to be fun, it's supposed to feel good, that's great. But, in most cases, like we recommend having no subs in spaces like that more often than we do having them.
So let's talk a little bit about your speaker selection. Like, what made you go with these speakers?
Yeah, so a long time ago, I was doing a big monitor shootout when it came time to upgrade monitors for this room. And I tested a whole bunch of different makes and models out, and I just really fell in love with these Focal Trio 11s. They just fit the space really nicely. They complement what I want out of a speaker really nicely. And then once I had worked on those for a handful of years when it came time to do the Atmos thing, it was partially the fact that I love the Focal sound and I love those Trio 11s. And so how do I choose a speaker that complements that while, also obviously I don't want to replace my pair of Trio 11s with something else that's just even more money to spend. And so it made sense to go with the Solo 6s everywhere else. It's a 914 system, which adds the wides. And then all of the mounts up top are on Acoustics mounts, and then the speaker stands are Argosy stands with the built-in Acoustics on them, and sound anchors up front with the Acoustics pucks under them. And we did some testing a while back when we compared different speaker stands, and we just found that the Acoustics pucks made a significant difference in the data, the measurements on paper, and in the sonic character of the speakers and the stereo image and the overall frequency response. So I elected to go with Acoustics stuff everywhere for all the mounts, the height mounts, and all the surrounds and everything. And then I custom made all cabling. Every single cable is made to the exact length all the way around, and tucked all the cables for the height speakers in behind the fabric, and then hid them all above the cloud, ran them down the inside of the unistrut so that way you couldn't see anything. So that is kind of how the rig was laid out.
So I know that you were involved a lot with testing the space, because I'm in Indianapolis and this is down in Nashville area. So that was a huge help to be able to just have you on site and being able to do all the testing and looking at the data, sending things to me, kind of working back and forth together. But I know that you do that often. And so that's obviously a huge part of this process, because once you place the speakers, and you got to make sure that it's going to perform right here, especially in Atmos spaces. It's important for every control room, but even more so in Atmos rigs.
Yeah. I think honestly a lot of it was predicated on the spot in the room more than anything. Even our placement we kind of tweaked for his exact location, and he wasn't kind of sure initially, like especially this back rack, like how close it was going to be, how far it was going to be, and obviously with the rear speakers kind of firing over the top of the rack, we wanted to ensure that that was kind of out of the way as much as possible while remaining functional. So, you know, that's usually where I start from a testing perspective, is like, well, what is the best place in the room that serves the ergonomic function of the customer? Because if it's like, yeah, it's great if it's a perfectly flat spot, but if it's in a place that doesn't make sense for all the gear and everything else, and it doesn't work for your workflow, like, you know, there's no point. It has to work inside of that creative portion.
So Colt already had the Trio 11s in here. Was there any challenges with matching those speakers to the surrounds and height channels?
A little bit. We always voice all the speakers in the same line as close as we can to one another, but obviously a speaker that's that large in a three-way versus a speaker that's a little more compact in a two-way has its challenges. So we initially set the system up, and I think we just delayed everything, and we hadn't got to the EQ section yet. We actually spent some time kind of figuring out why Colt liked the Trio so much, because stuff was coming off a little different than he was expecting just before we had done any of that. So we actually kind of made a target curve of what these were doing in the space, because we know he liked that. And then sort of applied that and evolved that to the solo, so everything conformed really nicely. But normally they integrate really well.
So one element of the room that didn't change a ton, you did thicken it, but the ceiling cloud existed before we got here.
It did.
And it was, working perfectly fine. It was the right size, the right location. It was just a matter of getting a little bit thicker, and then obviously the speakers had to get mounted into them as well. I remember seeing a time lapse of your video of you raising and lowering this cloud on your own. I want to know the story behind that.
It's a situation where unless you have 4 dudes with 4 ladders in here, that's really the only way to do it. So I literally would just, from that height, I would lower it 2 or 3 inches, move the ladder to the next corner, lower it 2 or 3 inches to the next corner, 2 or 3 inches, and I would just work my way around it. It took, I think lowering it originally from its height all the way down took, it was like 2 or 3 hours of just doing that, no breaks. Like it took forever. And then when I put it back up after it was modified and totally done, it's much more structurally sound now than it used to be. It's a lot stiffer.
Sure.
So I was able to do bigger chunks, and I learned I didn't put the insulation in it until it was almost all the way up to try to save for the weight. Because that's a big cloud, because what you'd have to do, I would put the whole cloud on my arm like this and lift the whole cloud, the tension up, and then unhook the chain and then squat on the ladder and then rehook it back up with one hand. It was brutal.
Yeah.
But that was one of the challenges, is making the cloud thicker, but we also raised it significantly in your plans. It was originally hanging quite a bit lower and at an angle.
Right.
And in order to get the height out of the front height channels, out of those speakers, we needed to get all the height we could out of it.
Yeah.
So even though we made it significantly thicker, it's within like 1 inch of touching the walls over there. It's as high as it can possibly be.
I know that one of the challenges in this room was to figure out how we're going to hang these height channels. And I say we like I did anything. I just kind of drew it on a piece of paper. Yeah, it kind of was. But maybe talk a little bit about that, because that's obviously something that's way different than just adding stands around the room.
Yeah. Anytime we're dealing with height speakers with an Atmos system, usually it's the hardest part of any install. And for a few reasons. One, I find is symmetry, actually. And two, just how accessible that is. And then also like the functional things like getting power and audio up there if you haven't planned for it, or if it's something that was installed after the fact and you can't run conduit or whatever you need to. But in this case, we ran Unistrut, which I really like to run because one, it kind of makes you follow the symmetry. If you don't have to guess that if you have individual mounts for each speaker, it ensures that at least on one axis you're in the same location if you've measured this piece of Unistrut versus this piece of Unistrut, right? Sure. So it sort of keeps you square. But in this case, we didn't know exactly where these things were going to fall because of the height of this cloud. So we knew if we could hang the Unistrut directly above the cloud and then we had the ability to move it forward and backward, we could really dial in that. And for those of you who don't know, Unistrut is like almost like a resilient channel. You'll see it kind of at Home Depot or whatever. You've definitely seen it before. And they have clips that go inside. So the clip sits inside, and then you can use like threaded rod or any kind of pipe thread or connector, depending on what your adapting system is, to hang whatever, maybe a speaker, a light fixture from the Unistrut. An added benefit, you can also hide cabling in it. You can do a bunch of things.
I thought it was a really clean way that you guys came up with doing that, because yeah, that's another thing, is that everybody does it a little bit differently and has a different method of cable management and power and all of that. But this was, I mean, the front speakers, the front height channels being mounted into the cloud, I thought that was a great idea. And then these back ones being just lowered down to be at the same height. Obviously a lot of work. It seems like you walk in here, you think like, oh, that probably didn't take very long. But it actually took a very long time to dial it in. Yeah,
I mean, once again, back to the planning stage, it was really just kind of planning and a lot of lasering and to figure out exactly where it needed to go. But once we figured that piece out, it actually went up pretty quickly. I mean, I think it was a matter of a few hours.
Yeah.
Versus, if you have a single mount, maybe you throw it up in the ceiling, and that's another huge benefit of Unistrut as well, is you can bridge the piece of strut across multiple studs in your ceiling, versus if you have just a single mount, maybe you miss a stud, and then what do you do? Like, I can't stress the safety component of this enough. If you're doing this, have a licensed, insured, somebody hang that. But unless you had, your client sign a waiver like I did with Colt. But it just makes it safer too, you know.
So Colt, can you walk me through a little bit of the rig that you have and some of the gear that you've chosen for the space?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the heart of the whole rig is really the Avid Pro Tools HDX rig. So we're running the Matrix Studio from Avid. That is hooked up via Thunderbolt and through the HDX card. And basically all of our room tuning, all the calibration, all the delay, all the different profiles, everything that kind of runs the monitoring side of things is happening in the Matrix Studio. And then I'm also running the Avid HDIO, and that is handling all of my hardware inserts. So anytime I'm patching a piece of hardware in, whether it's for mixing or for tracking or anything like that, that's all running through the HDIO. And then another one of the cool pieces is the Flock Patch, which is a digitally controlled full analog signal path patch bay. And what's really great about this is there's an app in the computer that I can save all the presets. I can literally save different profiles and different signal chains. And my favorite thing about it is when it comes time for like mastering or mix bus duties, it is so easy to audition different gear. So, sometimes maybe I'm auditioning the difference between the Solid State Logic Bus Plus or the Tube Tech or the Serpent SB4001 on a master. And it's just so easy to it's like bypassing plugins, really. It's so fast and easy to compare everything, or like whether you're talking about my signature Cappy preamps for saturation, or the Rupert Neve Designs MBT, or the SSL Fusion. It's just so easy to just slap stuff in and try different options out and figure out what's the right thing for the song. Because that's really a big part of what it is all about, is having the different colors and then figuring out which color complements the song the best. Another mainstay in the studio that I'm obsessed with is the SPL PQ Mastering Equalizer. This is on my mix bus when I'm mixing in stereo. and I master through that. And even in Atmos, a lot of these pieces of gear get used when it comes to adding color and saturation, reducing dynamic range, all of that kind of stuff. But instead of it being strapped across a mix bus, it will be used on individual stems, like a drum stem or a kick and snare stem or a vocal stem or something like that. So even in Atmos, and even if I'm being sent stems that are pre-mixed, a lot of the gear gets used even in that scenario.
So while you're relatively new in your journey of Atmos, like what have you learned in your early stages of doing these mixes?
The biggest thing that I've learned, the two biggest things, and I have to give huge props to Mike Miller, who sadly has passed away. I did a class with him at Sweetwater, and he just told us literally everything. And he probably cut, I don't know, 3, 4, 8 months off my learning curve.
Wow.
Because it was just like, I just started my very first mix with such a fundamental understanding of what the problems are and the challenges in the format are, thanks to him. And I played you my very first Atmos mix. And the two things that I think that are the biggest challenges are, one, finding the physical locations in the room that work well for some things and not well for other things. For instance, there are spots, and I will likely do a video on this eventually. There are spots around the room that, like, oh, if I put a shaker right there, that sounds awful in the headphones.
Sure.
Don't do that.
Yeah.
Where does it sound good? And then you play around with it and you find the good spots.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things. The other thing is the dynamics of different instruments. Well, really, the dynamics and the EQ. Go figure, all of it. I think in stereo, we spend so much time carving stuff up so it doesn't step on each other. So things work together like this instead of stepping on each other. You know, an acoustic guitar that's got a ton of 1K to 2.5K, that's really gonna collide with a vocal unless we carve it up and try to make sure that it is separated from it. But in Atmos, we just put it over there.
Yeah.
And somehow it still works in the fold down. I can't wrap my head around that part of it. So when I'm doing Atmos mixes for someone else that did the stereo mix and they've sent me stems, I spend an enormous amount of time unmangling everything.
Yeah.
That acoustic guitar that has been all carved up to not step on the vocal, I have to bring the life back to it in order for it to sound good over there. Otherwise, it just sounds like garbage.
Yeah.
That, and then the dynamics, you know, a kick and snare drum, since there's no mix bus and since there's no mastering limiter, you know, in a really dense hard rock or pop production, by the time you've went through your kick bus and your snare bus, and then that goes to your drum bus, and then that goes to your mix bus, and then it gets mastered, you know, that kick and snare is seeing somewhere in the range of 20, 30, 40 dB of gain reduction sometimes, depending on how squashed things are. But then in Atmos, it's just on its own. So kind of trying to walk the balance between replicating that compression, that clipping, that saturation, so that way the vibe of the music is still translated in the Atmos mix, but also not doing it so much that you ruin the point of the format and having huge dynamics.
Yeah.
That's walking that balance, that has been probably the biggest learning curve, is figuring out how to nail that.
Yeah. Like I said, watching you through this journey of creating this room and being a part of it, you know, like it tangentially a little bit, but it's always been something where I'm like, man, I'm so like proud of what he's doing and he's putting in this hard work, but then I was like, I can't wait for him to get to the other side of it. So now that you're at the other side of it, now when you post things, I'm just like, he's got to be relieved, but also just feel like you've done something great here, man.
Something great, and it's the most fun I've ever had working on music.
Wow.
It's like working in this format and having the fortune to work in a room like this, on a rig like this. It's so fun. And I'm not trying to say that like maybe I didn't have fun in stereo or I didn't have fun on other stuff. But I'm in my 21st year of making records, and there is some amount of like going through the motions. There is some amount of like, we just do X, Y, and Z, and then it's what I want it to be.
Yeah.
That kind of rhymed. I didn't even mean for that to happen. But starting over in this format and feeling like, you know, the world is your oyster and figuring out the different cool things you can do and like, it is crazy feeling like a beginner again.
Yeah.
And being able to experience that like hunger and that passion that I felt 20 years ago for trying to figure this thing out and learning how to make the most of it. That has been incredible.
Yeah. Well, and I think obviously getting this room dialed in and getting to the point where you feel like you can trust every bit of it, that helps a ton when you're learning something completely different. You don't have to, you know, wonder whether or not the room's lying to you.
100%. And yeah, between taking that class with Mike and between the design that you did and the tuning that Josh did and like all of that coming together to be like, I just mix in here now. And then when I check on the headphones, it's like, yep, that's what I did. Sounds great. Print, send it to the client. It's awesome.
That's so great.
It's great.
Well, I'm so happy for you, man. I really appreciate you getting us involved in the project.
Oh, I appreciate it more than you know.
Yeah, and wish you many fun years being a beginner again.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, man.
Thank you.